Thank you very much for inviting me to come along. I'm just going to talk to you about what we do and the background, the reasons why we do it, and what we're aiming to do in the future. And I've described this as the journey to zero carbon housing, and it is very much a journey, and we are still on that journey. So I'm one of the co-founders of Greencore Construction, and my current role is as Growth and Innovation Director. Right, hold on a second. We seem to have a hitch that the slides are not moving on. There we go, for some reason. So, no journey is complete without looking back to the starting point. And I started my career working on historic buildings. And I originally did a degree in physics, but worked on building sites, and I thought building was far more fun than physics. So I became a builder rather than a physicist. And I was really lucky to sort of fall into the repair of historic buildings of all sorts, masonry, timber framed, and also from about 2000 onwards, windmills and water mills as well. So I didn't start off as an environmentalist. I started off as a fairly down-to-earth practical builder, but it was really after getting involved in windmills and water mills in the early 2000s that we had to really look at what the weather was doing to be able to plan our work. And once you start looking at weather and weather patterns, it becomes pretty undeniable that we're experiencing climate change. So in the early 2000s, we saw lots and lots of floods, which made it difficult to work on water mills. And this is a windmill in Kent that we did some minor repair works to. And soon after we'd finished that, it got hit by a freak storm in 2003 and blown over and smashed to bits. And over a period of time, observing weather, it became obvious to me that climate change was real. And I thought that some of the things that we did in the repair of historic buildings had a role to play in new buildings. And also, we had come across people who were doing environmental building projects because we had knowledge and experience of using things like lime mortars and renders. We occasionally got drawn into projects like this, which was the first straw bale house in Wales. I think it was 1996, so just over 25 years ago, and we got involved in rendering the outside of it. And for me, it was a little bit of a novelty, but an interesting experience. But it's quite scary to think that in the 25 years since we did this, as a species, we have doubled our CO2 emissions. We've emitted more CO2 in the last 25 years than we did in all the centuries leading up to that. So these are all the different pieces of the jigsaw that fitted together to start making me think about sustainability and carbon impact. And from 2002, I got involved in setting up a company called Lime Technology to try and bring the benefits of lime mortar to new building and to persuade people to use lime rather than cement in masonry. And that's because lime is strong enough to stick the bricks together, but it's weak enough that you can actually get the bricks apart when the building comes to the end of its life. And so these are some of the projects that we supplied lime mortar to in the early 2000s. And we probably got involved in hundreds, if not thousands, of quite major new build projects using lime mortar. And then we moved on to looking at other ways that we could use lime in new building. And I came across an architect in Suffolk called Ralph Carpenter, who was working with Lime-Hemp. And I was really impressed with the work that he did. And we started collaborating with Ralph and doing some research at Bath University. And before we knew it, we were supplying lime and hemp to people who were doing new building of all sorts. So these are all social housing projects, some quite grand one-off individual self-build projects, and also some non-domestic buildings. On the left here, you've got the Heritage Skills Centre at Lincoln Castle. And on the right, it's the WISE building at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales. And the very first Lime-Hemp building we did was Adnams Brewery on the left-hand side here, which was about 2005, 2006. and that had the largest green roof in the country at the time. And then later we did Marks and Spencer's at Cheshire Oaks, which is the biggest Marks and Spencer's outside Oxford Street. So over a period of few years, we did a few hundred houses and about 50 or 60 non-domestic buildings. And that led to setting up Greencore Construction in 2013, where we decided to focus exclusively on residential. And the main reason for that was not wanting to be a subcontractor to big contractors who can be quite aggressive at times, and you feel as if you're fighting the contractor as well as trying to do the work. So since we set up Greencore, we've built about 60 houses since we did that in 2013. And we've currently got 300 to 400 going through the planning process at the moment. And we're on a journey of growth. And the reason we're doing this is all really set against the backdrop of climate change. So at the COP conference in Paris in 2016, most of the countries of the world agreed to try and limit the rise in global temperatures to 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees. And as you will all know, the IPCC reports are saying that it's going to be incredibly difficult to limit that rise to 1.5 degrees. But if we do, we've really got to halve our CO2 emissions by 2030. And we're already at 1 degree rise, and we're seeing the consequences of that at the moment. So last summer, for example, we all saw 40 degrees in the UK for the first time ever. And we all knew it was coming at some point, but I don't think many of us expected it to happen quite so quickly. And these records are now tumbling on a regular basis, and we're breaking these records not just by fractions of a degree, but in some cases more than 1 degree at a time, which is quite significant. And last summer, with those 40-degree heats, we saw bushfires, grass fires, houses catching fire. We see floods and bushfires all over the world. And David Attenborough sums it up quite well when he says what we do in the next 10 years will profoundly impact the next few thousand. And it is that significant. We've got 10 years of action ahead of us to try and mitigate the worst effects of climate change. So if we look at what's happening in terms of legislation, both locally and nationally, Greencore is based in Oxfordshire, and here in Oxfordshire, we've seen all the local authorities declare a climate emergency. All local authorities have signed up with Bioregional to make Oxfordshire the first one planet county in the world. And we also have Oxford Friends of the Earth leading an initiative called the Oxfordshire Zero Carbon Homes Initiative. So there's quite a lot happening in Oxfordshire. It feels like quite an exciting place. And if we look at the UK as a whole, we've got the Climate Change Act, which sets this target to reduce our emissions by 100% by 2050 to get to zero carbon. We've got the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget, Boris's Green Recovery Plan, although that seems to be losing momentum. And we've got this relatively recent target of reducing UK emissions by 78% by 2035. So we see that all the high level initiatives are there. What we don't necessarily see is the detail on the ground of how we're going to achieve all of these different targets. Now, as a result of the climate conference in Paris and those global emissions targets, every local authority now has a carbon budget. And if you go on to the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and follow the necessary links, they've done a piece of work with Manchester University, which has broken this down local authority by local authority. So here in Oxfordshire, we've got 4 district councils and a city council, and we've got a combined carbon budget of just over 26 million tonnes of emissions. So that's our budget from now to the end of the century. But the reality is we're going to be zero carbon by 2050. So that budget, depending on how you look at it, is either our budget from now till 2050, or it's our budget forever. really. We cannot afford to be emitting more carbon than that. But we think the elephant in the room is embodied carbon. And for those of you that are unsure about what embodied carbon is, it's the carbon emissions that come from the extraction, manufacturing, processing, firing, transport of building materials to get them from their raw material state to the point where they are assembled into a building on site. And an average new house is responsible for over 100 tons of emissions at the construction stage. So when I say an average house, that would be, say, 100 square meter footprint, and it's going to emit over 100 tons of CO2. And that's what's often referred to as its carbon footprint. And then once that house is finished and in use, it will emit somewhere between 3 and 5 tons of CO2 per year in use. So a new house that's built this year will be responsible for around 200 tons of emissions by 2050. So you can see that this is completely incompatible with a roadmap of getting to zero emissions by 2050, when every new house we build is contributing to the problem. And companies are now beginning to assess their carbon footprint, and some are publishing it. So Taylor Wimpey very bravely published in their 2020 sustainability review that their emissions per 100 square meter house in terms of scopes 1, 2 and 3 amounted to 209.8 tons of CO2. That has since improved in their 2021 review, and no doubt they will work hard to continue improving it. But if we look at the RIBA figures, the RIBA assess that business as usual equates to 120 tons of emissions. Taylor Wimpey's figure is 210 tons. But very often these are inconsistent measurements. We need to do more work on how the measuring is done and how it's reported, because we're not always comparing like with like in this situation. So back to what David Attenborough says, that what we do in the next 10 years will profoundly impact the next few thousand. What we're likely to do in the next 10 years in Oxfordshire is build 100,000 new houses. And that will use 80% of Oxfordshire's carbon budget just on building those houses alone. So that carbon budget should be for not just new buildings, it should be for running our existing buildings, transport, industry, agriculture, all of those things. But we're going to get through 80% of that carbon budget just on new housing over the next 10 years. And if we were to build them at the level that Taylor Wimpey's emissions are, we'll actually use 100% of that budget by 2029. So business as usual can't continue. We have to do something different. Now, part of the problem is that when most people are talking about zero carbon, what they really mean is the operational emissions. That's what's measured in building regulations, and that's what most people consider to be the carbon impact. But we need to tackle the embodied carbon as well as the operational emissions, because as I said before, the embodied carbon is the elephant in the room. And we are very fortunate that nature has a natural carbon capture and storage mechanism, which is plants. So trees and plants all capture carbon as they grow. We use hemp in our buildings, and this is probably what you think of when you think about hemp, hippies and marijuana. What we actually use is industrial hemp, which is a serious crop produced on an industrial scale on large farms and processed into a range of different products. A lot of it goes into the automotive sector. So people like BMW use hemp and other natural fibers in their interiors of their cars. Lotus, about 15 years ago, made a prototype, Lotus Elise, where the whole body shell was made out of hemp and a lot of the interior was hemp as well. And in fact, this is nothing new. Henry Ford built the first hemp car in 1947, 48, something like that. And the reason this is so good is that bio-based materials absorb CO2 as they grow, and they, through the energy from the sun and photosynthesis, they turn that into cellulose and and the oxygen is given back to the atmosphere. And if you work through the maths, it actually takes 1.8 kilograms of CO2 to make 1 kilo of cellulose. So in very simple terms, the more bio-based materials we incorporate in buildings, the more carbon we lock up. We've done embodied carbon studies on some houses that we've built. And if we look at this, this is a typical house. So the emissions at the construction stage amounted to 360 kilos per square meter, but we were locking up 700 kilos of CO2 per square meter in all of those bio-based materials. So for the structure and shell of the building, we were actually locking up 340 kilos of CO2 per square meter of floor area. And if you then extrapolate that across the whole life carbon of the building, that equates to minus 278 kilos per square meter. So we know that we can lock up CO2 in buildings, and we know that we can increase the amount of tree planting. There was a great study done by a Swiss university where they looked at the potential of tree planting, and they came to the conclusion that if we planted 1 trillion trees worldwide, that would be enough to capture all the CO2 and reverse climate change. Now, 1 trillion trees sounds a huge amount, but this news clip on the right-hand side here from 2019 shows that in Ethiopia, they planted 350 million trees in a single day. So if countries like Ethiopia can be doing that, we could all be planting millions and millions of trees. And there's enough space to plant this number of trees without encroaching on building land or agricultural land. And if we plant a lot more trees, we can start to look at timber and engineered timber in all sorts of buildings and building products. So things like cross-laminated timber and glulam can be used in multi-story buildings. So the tallest timber building on the left here is in Brisbane, but the one on the right here is in South London, Elephant and Castle, part of I think a Landsec project that was done on 7-story apartments using cross-laminated timber. And the engineering and potential of CLT is increasing all the time. At Greencore, we don't tend to do the high-rise buildings. We're tending to do 2- and 3-story domestic buildings, but we're building houses out of timber and hemp. So we're locking up carbon, and the houses can look like anything, any shape, size that you want, with a range of different finishes on the outside. So the more bio-based materials we incorporate in buildings, the more carbon we lock up. So when we come to do our design, the choices that we make, they don't just affect the aesthetics of the building, but they determine the carbon footprint and the thermal performance and operational efficiency of the building as well. And so if we make the right choices, we know that we can build houses that have got 0 carbon footprint and 0 emissions. And our view is that's what we should all be aiming for. Which brings us to Springfield Meadows, a project of 25 houses, 9 affordable, 16 open market houses of all different shapes and sizes. And we set ourselves a target here to have 0 carbon footprint, to build everything to deliver Passivhaus levels of thermal performance so that they had minimal heating requirements, but also they're comfortable and healthy. Passivhaus standard is as much about comfort and health as it is about energy. And so these would be net zero energy in use. So the idea was that they had enough roof-mounted PVs that they would generate the same amount of energy each year as they use, and that would lead to low energy bills. The project has an electric car club and the car sharing scheme, a partnership with the Bucks and Oxen Wildlife Trust to help with all the planting and wildlife and biodiversity on the site. And this is all wrapped up within the One Planet Living framework. And Bioregional have assessed the project as a global leadership project. So the secret formula, it's not that secret, as you can imagine, that's why I'm telling you, is very simple. We use bio-based materials to lock up carbon. and then the Passivhaus principles from the Passivhaus standard. So high levels of insulation, designing out thermal bridging, excellent levels of air tightness. We use triple glazed timber windows, heat recovery ventilation, and there's no fossil fuels on the site. So it's electric heating, electric hot water, and electric cooking. And then we're using PVs to generate the energy and batteries to store it. On future schemes, we're looking to take that a step further, where we have a smart microgrid on the site, so that all the PVs and batteries are aggregated at site level to minimize the amount of energy that's exported to the grid, and also minimizing the amount that's imported from the grid in order to balance that. So having worked our way through this journey, back in January 2020, we decided that we were going to launch a plan to deliver 500 houses in Oxfordshire over the next 5 years. And we said we were going to deliver 500 what we call climate positive homes. So when we say climate positive, this was taking things to the next level. So not just zero carbon, but actually locking up more carbon than they emit at the construction stage, and generating more energy than they use, increasing wildlife and biodiversity, which of course is now coming into planning anyway. And we want our schemes, if we can do enough houses, to be a catalyst for other things such as local food production, green transport. And we're working with the local community energy schemes where possible, to not just make our development zero carbon, but have an impact on neighbouring villages, and if possible, make neighbouring villages zero carbon as well. So one project we've been looking at has scope for 5 to 7 megawatts of ground mounted PV alongside the project, which could make the whole local village net zero energy. So having launched that plan in January 2020, of course, March 2020, COVID came along, and that rather slowed things down and made things awkward. But there were also, I think, some social benefits that came out of COVID, not least the rise of the ESG agenda, where we're seeing more and more people realize that if we can't control something as simple as a virus, then we're not going to be able to control climate change. And we are seeing institutions and big companies really start to look very seriously at ESG, that's environmental, social and governance, and build it into their business plans and reporting structures. And at COP26 in November 2021, Mark Carney said that we've reached a watershed moment, as $130 trillion of institutional money is committed to hitting net zero. For our own small part, we have now tied a deal with M&G, one of the big UK institutions, and they invested in the equity of Greencore in January 2022, and they've pledged up to 500 million of investment for UK climate positive homes. So our mission now is to find enough sites where we can build climate positive homes to spend that 500 million for them. And if we look at the carbon impacts that came from Springfield Meadows, it saved about 2,500 tonnes of embodied carbon, and it should save 3,750 tonnes of operational emissions over the next 30 years. So with the backing of M&G, we're building a team and scaling up the business, and we plan to build 10,000 houses over the next 12 years, which will save about 2 million tonnes of emissions compared to business as usual. And if all houses in the UK were built in this way, it would save about 600 million tonnes of CO2 over the next 30 years, which is equivalent to about 5% of the UK's emissions during this period. So it's pretty significant. The construction industry and the house building sector has the potential to make a big difference. And as we often say, the best way to predict the future is to create it. In fact, we didn't say it, Peter Drucker said it first, but we often repeat it. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Shall I hand back to you, Simon, for managing any questions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, thanks for that, Ian. Really, really interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the investment at the end, because it just goes to show what growth path you're on. I mean, when you talk about if all houses were built the way you're advocating, is it actually possible to do that? I mean, are there enough supplies of hemp and lime to do so?
There are. I mean, obviously, so when I say there could be. There's plenty of lime. That's no problem at all. Lime is produced on an industrial scale already. There's the potential to scale up the supply chain of hemp and other bio-based materials at a fast enough pace to keep pace with this growth. Timber already exists in these sort of quantities. We've been doing studies of forest cover of timber across Europe and how that is not only being sustainably managed to produce timber, but actually the volume of grown timber is increasing all the time through FSC management and other schemes like that. So the challenge is to grow those supply chains at the same pace at which we make the change from masonry construction to bio-based construction, but it's all possible. Where there's a will, there's a way.
Cool. No, thank you. There are a few questions here. Just SC, I'm not sure what SC stands for, so forgive me. So the question here is, what type of foundations are you using for the houses in Springfield? Oh, sorry, it's Sophia. I should have read that at first. So Sophia's asked, what type of foundations are you using?
Yes, very good question. These are all built on insulated rafts. So the rafts use a combination of expanded and extruded polystyrene for insulation and low cement concrete in the rafts. So it's very difficult to use bio-based materials in the ground. Hence, these are polystyrene and concrete. And then we use the bio-based materials above ground to offset the carbon impact of those materials.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And then Stephen's made some questions here. Stephen, did you want to come off mute and ask your questions? Seems you're based in Oxfordshire. No. Well, you can see can you see the questions there, Ian? Stephen's asked about regarding PV panels and how he's had some pushback in Oxfordshire, which I don't think is the only place where there's been pushback on PV panels in conservation areas. And it's how are you managing that conversation? Are you receiving preferential planning, not decisions, but guidance because of the nature of what you're trying to achieve?
No, I absolutely agree with Stephen. We face quite a lot of resistance from planners. So if I just sort of go back, these houses at Springfield had PVs on them. It took us 18 months to get planning approval for the PVs. We very nearly lost the sale of the affordable houses to the Housing Association because we had rushed ahead and put all the PVs on the roof, expecting a quick planning decision and support from the planners. And at the point that we were handing them over to the Housing Association, we still hadn't got planning consent. We almost had to rescaffold them and strip the panels off to be able to hand them over. But fortunately, the Housing Association were enlightened and took the view that planning would be forthcoming, and they took a chance on it. But we've got other schemes where planners are saying, "Oh, can't we have fewer PVs, or can't we hide the PVs around the back, despite the fact it's the north side, they won't get any sun," and stupid things like this. So the planning system is at least 10 years out of date and is not aligned with the delivery of the Climate Change Act, and is one of the obstacles that we face on a daily or weekly basis.
And who's driving that push for change within the planning community then? Because it's just ridiculous.
I'm not sure anybody is driving it. I don't get that impression it's being driven at all. It's frustrating. It's also, even if somebody is driving it, it's a very slow pace of change. Yeah. Back to the quote from David Attenborough, you know, what we do in the next 10 years is going to make a big difference. And if it takes 10 years to change planning policy, that's going to be too late.
Yeah, yeah. Stephen's also asked, how are you balancing the embodied carbon in the PV panels, which comes up time and time again, actually, in other webinars, and the batteries.
Yeah, so to be perfectly honest, at the moment, the embodied carbon of the PV panels and batteries don't figure in those calculations because of the methodologies, but they need to going forward. And at the moment, the only way to balance the carbon in those is against bio-based materials. But as our supply chains decarbonize, the carbon footprint of various other things will come down, but we need to be making decisions on selecting PV panels that are made in a low carbon process rather than a high carbon process. So we're now looking at the embodied carbon of panels and other parts of our supply chain so that we can make decisions not just on price and appearance, but on carbon impact as well.
Yeah, I mean, when Nigel Banks spoke a couple of weeks ago, I mean, they said they have quite a practical and nuanced sort of stance towards this, in terms of, yes, some materials will deliver more embodied carbon than others, but ultimately they are trying to increase and match the housing supply that's required with lower carbon homes, which is better than what the masses are doing at the moment, and just trying to make a difference, whilst, as you say, the supply chain catches up, and, you know, technology and innovations will allow us to secure and work with sort of less intensively carbonized products going forward.
Yes, I think we need
to do something.
We need everybody pushing as hard as they feel they're able to push. We probably are pushing harder than some other people.
Yeah.
But we feel that gives us a means of differentiating ourselves from other people as well.
Yeah, well, this is it. I mean, at the moment, you're. I don't know whether it's because, I mean, I don't know whether mesh work is an echo chamber. It is to a degree, and, you know, preaching to converted. But, you know, we have Oliver Novakovic from Barratt Homes speaking in a couple of weeks. It does feel as if now, from a commercial perspective, and the premiums that you can charge. I mean, I live in an old Edwardian terrace, as people sort of know on the call, and it's frustratingly cold, and it'd be, and the energy that we're using is just going straight out through the sieve of a house. You know, people now are willing to pay more for homes that are more effective and efficient, and low builds, zero build homes, etc. So at the moment, you know, M&G are investing in you because they can see that as a business model, it works. But obviously, from a business model, you're providing climate positive homes. It's a win-win. And, you know, we're a tipping point where the older homes, naturally, people will stop wanting, where people like to live in houses with features, etc. They're probably going to go forward. They'll be much more prepared to live in a Greencore home than they've ever done before.
I think you're right. There's a premium possible, and I think that premium is increasing. If you compare us to somebody like Barratt's, you know, they are a big company who are building lots of houses each year, and for them the challenge is to change the way they build. For us, the challenge is to scale up the way we the number of homes that we build without diluting what we do. You mentioned low bills and zero bills. At the moment, we have a problem in this country that we are trying to move all new homes over to electricity, but electricity is outrageously expensive compared to gas. Yeah. So if you look at low energy, low carbon, low cost, they aren't all directly aligned. The lower carbon solutions are often still quite expensive. So alongside the sort of things that we're trying to do, we also need to see the energy markets reform, and the government are beginning to make the right noises on this at the moment, that if we don't change the way electricity is priced, it's going to get very painful for everybody after 2025, when there are no more gas boilers and everybody's running on electricity. So we've got to see some of the tax subsidies come away from fossil fuels, and some of the green surcharges come away from electricity to align those two things more closely.
Yeah, you would expect that to happen. Sorry, 2 seconds. Someone's raised their hand. Who has raised their hand? I've just got it. It popped up and then the names disappeared. I just have a raised hands. Was it Rosie from memory?
Alison.
Alison, sorry. I don't know where I got Rosie from. Sorry, Alison.
That's all right. That's okay. I came in 10 minutes late into this, so I'm sure you are speaking to the converted to most of us, but it's fantastic to hear everything that you're doing. I mean, as a business, we look to fund more sustainable building. And what I missed in the presentation so far was whether you are involving technology within the houses itself to monitor. Is that part of the framework within the house?
So at Springfield Meadows, we have retrofitted monitoring technology into about a third of the houses. Okay. All the houses are having the high level data recorded, which is total energy use and PV generation, but a third of them have then got much more granular monitoring data to monitor heating, hot water, ventilation, cooking, and all of those sorts of things. And that's an ongoing study at the moment to gather that data over the next few years. But the technology of monitoring it is getting easier and better and cheaper. So on future schemes, we'll be building it in from scratch. Wi-Fi enabled circuit breakers in fuse boards that just collect all that data routinely from day one. Great.
Okay, it's a big area that the institutional investors and some of the seed funds that they're all looking for the data where we're retrofitting and where we're building is having an impact, positive impact on the environment. So the more data that we can produce, the more funding that's coming down, and that seems to be for us where we have a tipping point. Where's the data? And the chicken and the egg is, well, buy the money, we'll show you the data. So but fantastic to hear, so thank you very much.
Where are you from, Alison?
Boutique Capital. So we were in the traditional lending space as a lender. We now act as a broker, but I'm focusing purely on sustainable development. So ESG-led programs, ESG-led financing, signatories that sign up to principles for responsible investment, whereby the entire supply chain and build all come together. So I just basically, from being a lifelong tree hugger, I've found my niche within financing these projects. So yeah, and I have animals as well. So
I think it's an exciting space because
yeah, so great to hear, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the.
Great, thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Alison. Actually, it's a topic that we haven't really covered, actually, and I didn't know whether it was going to be too niche and how many people are on the call or on that meshwork that would be interested in tapping into finance like that. And obviously Ian has, but it is an area that, and I know Doug from Mesh Energy is speaking to a lot of investor types as well. So yeah, it is an area that I might follow up with you afterwards if that's okay. Thank you. Cool. Cheers. Celia, did you want to ask your question? No. Cecilia did ask, when you talk about carbon savings benchmarks, what are you referring to? Blah, blah, blah. I would suppose it's based on the same area residence number of houses, a conventional construction.
So we're generally referring to 100 square metre house because it's not far off the national average, and it's a nice round number. And it equates to, for example, the Taylor Wimpey sustainability report is all based on 100 square metre houses. So it's a nice, easy metric to bring everything back to.
Yeah, cool. Okay. And then when I was wandering around Future Build when was it, a couple of months back, or there were lots of stalls there, suppliers from a bio-based perspective, nature. How many do you work with? Do you work with different suppliers, or is it always the same one? I mean,
we tend to work with the same ones, and that's partly because once you've got a product designed and accredited, it's all about consistency and quality control and not changing suppliers on a regular basis. But we know most of the ones. I was at Future Build. Obviously, we bumped into each other, didn't we? And I was really pleased to see so many bio-based products there, and it's great to encourage them all.
Yeah, no, definitely. If anyone else has any more questions, please ask them. Otherwise, Ian, what should I be asking you? What's a common question that I haven't asked?
So nobody's mentioned cost at the moment, which is a surprise. That normally comes up fairly early on. How much does it cost to build like this? At the moment, I think we are no more than 5 to 10% more expensive than conventional construction. But construction is very much linked to supply chains and procurement and volumes. And we expect that as we do more houses, our costs will come down. We also expect that the mainstream prices will go up as the Future Home Standard kicks in. And I think by about 2026, 27, we'll probably cross over each other with our prices coming down as the mainstream goes up. But even at 5 to 10% more expensive on the construction, that represents 2 to 3% of the value of a finished house, and a number of these houses can command a premium of 10%, for example. So the economics work even as we are.
I mean, I didn't ask that question because I sort of, I can see that, and when we were speaking to Emma Osmondson, who was previously at Exeter City Living, and she was involved with the Passivhaus conference, which was actually down in Exeter. This came up in conversation at the time, and they mentioned around about sort of the 5 to 7% premium, but there are so few houses of the stature and the nature that you've built that there's not enough being made to dilute the premium. So everyone should be looking to do this. And yes, it is more expensive, but for me, if I was in the business of building houses, this is definitely the way I would be going at the moment in time. Sophia's asked if you've been back to the first houses you built from 2013 and check out with the residents how they feel about it. I presume they're providing some great testimonials.
Yes, so I think it's one of the things that we could be better at. So I live in one of the first houses we built, so I've got a direct link to feedback on that, and that house is also instrumented in gathering data at the moment. We keep in touch with some of the people who live in the houses that we built 10 years ago, but not all of them by any means, but the ones that we do know are very happy.
Cool. And Ollie, did you want to come off mute? I'm bored of the sound of my own voice. I'm asking other people to come off mute, but if they don't wish to, then
Hey there, yeah.
Oh, hi Ollie.
Having a chat. So Thanks again for the presentation. Really appreciate it. I just wanted to ask about the panels themselves, the hemp line panels, the Biond systems that you use. And from what I've seen over the years, it's like a lot of hemp projects can be quite labor intensive with the products you're using, although a lot safer. And do you see that process of building the panels becoming more automated? Because I know a lot of timber frame manufacturers are moving towards fully automated factories and stuff like that. Or will it take a bit longer, do you think, because of the materials you're using?
It can be automated, or parts of it can be easily automated, and we're doing that at the moment. I don't think we see the value in automating all of it, because it's a balance between the capital cost of doing that and the flexibility of what you can build. And so part of our approach is to try and keep the capital cost of setting up a factory as low as possible, and to keep that factory as flexible as possible to be able to build different size, shapes and designs of houses. And the more we move to automation, the more the capital cost goes up and the flexibility goes down. So it's a balance between the two.
Okay, thank you.
Cool, thank you. Cheers, Ollie. No, that's been very informative. Thank you. And it's great to have a house builder on that's going way beyond what everyone else is doing. So when you mentioned about you feel that you're the most sustainable development in the country, how did you come to that conclusion? I know you're mixing with other people who are doing stuff similar to you, and it is a small world, but is it just because no one else is doing stuff? Well, obviously it's because no one else is doing stuff like this.
Well, it is a small world, and we think we know most of the other people who are out there doing things. There are some other good people around we're all on journeys at different rates and different size developments. And this project here was finished 9 months ago, and the things that we build in the future will take another step forward. So we also expect other people to, some of the people we know and are in correspondence with, to be also taking steps forward. So this won't remain as the most sustainable development. We hope we will beat it, and we hope other people will beat it as well. It was just that point in time when it was done. We believe it was, but it depends on how you benchmark these things. But there was nothing that we did here that hadn't been done somewhere else. But I think it was the first time all of these things were brought together in one place at the same time.
Yeah. And then just lastly, going back to sort of the planning, I know everyone sort of bangs their head against a brick wall when it comes to the planning, but and again, I mentioned we have Barratt developments on in a couple of weeks. That I don't know whether it's pie in the sky, but if everyone needs to be on the same agenda in order to secure land, are there conversations, and I presume it's part of your pitch where you are delivering developments as Springfield Meadows, that are councils willing to look at them more favourably?
So I think the elected councillors really support the sort of things that we're doing. The problems come when you get into planning officers whose job is just to implement the existing planning policy, not to think outside the box. We've even got projects at the moment where our client is potentially the council. The landowner is the council, but we're collectively banging our heads against the brick wall with the planners in the same council. So there is a disconnect between the two at the moment, and I hope things will change, but we're not seeing enough signs of that at the moment.
No, well, I too hope there will be change. And just because you're in the area, I saw something, King's College chapel with the PV panels. Is that actually happened, or do they have planning permission to put the PV panels on the chapel, and presumably that's going to create some sort of precedent there as well in the area.
I honestly don't know the details of that, so I can't answer it, I'm afraid.
No, it's fine. I just saw it in one of these pieces, and it was quite interesting. One would hope that does create a precedent to allow stuff like that to happen. But Ian, if there's no more questions from anyone else, and we're almost out of time anyway, that's been really, really interesting. Thank you. Appreciate the time that you've taken to join us. Thanks for everyone else to ask all of the questions and participate as well. I will upload it to Meshwork, as I said. If you can follow us on LinkedIn, that would be great. Thank you very much. Yeah, and we will see you next week. I think we have a call on change of tack next week. We have a call on infrared heating. We bang the drum a lot on heat pumps, so next week we're going to be talking about infrared. So I hope to see many of you on there, and if not, the one after. But yeah, thanks, Ian. I appreciate that. And
thanks, Simon. Thanks everybody for listening.
Cheers, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye.